The sun had barely set when the widow's world was torn apart. Papers signed in haste, debts twisted by lies, and a banker's cold smile had stripped her of everything she owned. The house where her children were born, the fields her husband had plowed until his dying breath, and the dignity of her name, all stolen under the pretense of law. The townsfolk whispered, but did not intervene. In the Old West, money often carried more power than justice. That night, she sat in the ruins of her porch, grief and rage burning hotter than the oil lamps in the banker's window. Her hands trembled as she clutched her late husband's rifle, the metal still bearing the scars of past battles. For years, she had been seen as fragile, a woman surviving on scraps of mercy. Yet as the darkness deepened, something inside her shifted. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a soul sharpened by loss, her heart pounding with the rhythm of vengeance. In the silence of that night, she made a choice. Tomorrow would not come quietly. The banker celebrated his triumph in town, raising glasses of whiskey while boasting of his cleverness. To him, she was already defeated, another broken figure swallowed by the dust of the frontier. But he underestimated the kind of fire that loss can awaken. For in the West, despair often forged a weapon stronger than steel. And while he slept in comfort, the widow's resolve grew fierce, her grief transforming into the steady calm of a hunter stalking her prey. The night was long, but her eyes never closed. She sat by the window with the rifle across her lap, the moonlight catching the determined lines on her face. The land may no longer have been hers on paper, but it was written in her blood, in her husband's sweat, and in the cries of her children. To let it go without a fight was to betray all she had lived for. And so she waited for dawn, when the first light would not only break the horizon, but break the silence she had carried for too long. When morning came, the streets of the town stirred with routine, the clatter of hooves, the shuffle of boots, the murmur of markets. But then came a sound that froze even the boldest tongue, the sharp click of a rifle's lever. At the end of the street, framed by the rising sun, stood the widow. Her black dress whipped in the wind, her hands steady, her eyes fixed on the banker's door. She had lost everything under his greed, but now she returned with fire in her heart and iron in her hands. And this time, it would not be mercy that she carried, it would be judgment. The banker's laughter echoed inside his office, his boots propped on the desk, while coins clinked between his greedy fingers. He believed the world belonged to men like him, men who bent laws to their will and crushed the weak without consequence. But that morning, as the sun spilled over the town's dusty street, his laughter died in his throat. The widow's silhouette stood framed in the doorway, her rifle gleaming with the first light of dawn. She was no longer a victim. She was judgment incarnate, and every eye in the saloon and marketplace turned toward her. The townsfolk froze, their conversations cut short. Women clutched their shawls tighter, men stiffened where they stood. Everyone knew what the widow had lost, and most had turned their faces away when the banker had taken her land. Now, they watched silently as she strode forward, her dress trailing in the dust, her steps slow and deliberate. The West had seen many standoffs, but never one like this. A woman armed not by reputation, but by desperation turned into iron resolve. The banker tried to mask his surprise with arrogance. He stepped outside, his voice oily and mocking. "Put that gun away, woman. You got no place here." His words dripped with the same poison he had used to sign away her life. But the widow's grip tightened on the rifle, her eyes locked on him with a steadiness that silenced even the boldest hecklers. For the first time, the banker felt a chill crawl down his spine. The widow's silence spoke louder than threats. She let the rifle's barrel rest on her arm, her gaze never wavering. The street stretched quiet as a graveyard, the only sound the distant creak of a sign swaying in the wind. Every man and woman watching held their breath, sensing they were witnessing the moment when the powerless became something far more dangerous, the righteous. Finally, the widow spoke, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "You took what was mine, what was my family's. Today, I take back what cannot be stolen, my honor." Her words were not shouted, but they carried farther than any bullet. The banker shifted uneasily, realizing too late that the widow had already won half the battle. by forcing him to stand in the light of his own crimes, with the whole town as witness. The standoff stretched as the sun climbed higher, painting the street in gold. The widow stood unyielding, her rifle steady, while the banker tried to gather his composure. He sneered, forcing a laugh, though the sound was brittle. "Honor doesn't pay debts," he spat. But his words rang hollow, bouncing off the silence of the crowd that had grown tired of his schemes. The widow's presence had cracked something open in the hearts of those watching, a reminder that fear had ruled them too long. The sheriff appeared then, his badge glinting in the light. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. For years he had looked the other way, knowing the banker's gold lined too many pockets. But as he watched the widow, a strange thing stirred inside him, shame. The kind of shame a man feels when reminded of his own cowardice. He placed his hand on his revolver, not in defense of the banker, but to acknowledge the weight of the law he had neglected. The widow turned her eyes briefly toward the sheriff, then back to the banker. "You think this town belongs to you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "But it belongs to those who work its soil, who bury their dead here, who live and bleed for every grain of wheat that grows in the dust. My husband gave his life for this land, and you—" Her eyes narrowed. "You stole it with ink and lies." The townsfolk murmured, some nodding, others tightening their fists at their sides. For the first time, the banker's mask slipped. His face flushed, his arrogance faltered. He glanced at the sheriff, searching for support, but found none. The lawman's silence was damning, his stance shifting as though ready to let the widow's justice play out. Fear flickered across the banker's eyes. Not fear of death, but fear of exposure, of losing the grip he had on the town. The rifle aimed at him was not just a weapon. It was a mirror reflecting every sin he had buried under contracts and coins. The widow stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the banker's boots. "You thought I was powerless because I was a woman, because I was a widow," she said, her voice breaking into steel. "But you forgot one truth the West never lets a man forget. When you take everything from someone, you leave them nothing to fear." The words cut deeper than any bullet, and the crowd felt their weight. The tide was turning, not with violence yet, but with truth too sharp to be denied. The banker's lips curled into a bitter snarl, his arrogance fighting desperately against the fear clawing at his chest. "You think one rifle makes you strong?" he hissed, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This town runs on money, not pity, and I own every inch of it." Yet even as he spoke, his voice cracked, betraying the truth that no gold could shield him from the widow's unflinching gaze. His bravado faltered, and the crowd began to murmur louder, the weight of his words crumbling under the power of hers. The widow did not move, did not blink. Her rifle remained steady, her hands calm, her breath even. She had faced nights of hunger, days of toil, and the crushing silence of grief. The fear of death could not shake her now. In her silence, she was teaching the town a lesson sharper than iron. That true strength is not loud, nor gilded with wealth, but carved into the bones of those who have lost everything and yet still stand. The sheriff shifted uneasily, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. He had known of the banker's corruption, had turned his head away too many times, and now the sight of the widow's defiance was a mirror to his own cowardice. He felt the crowd's eyes on him, questioning whether he would uphold the law or continue to cower behind gold. With a slow breath, his hand dropped away from his revolver. The message was clear. Today, justice would not come from a badge, but from the barrel of a widow's rifle. A ripple of courage spread through the townsfolk. Men who had lost cattle to unfair loans, women who had seen their homes stripped by contracts, and children who had grown hungry under the banker's greed began to straighten their backs. Their silence shifted, no longer one of fear, but of quiet rebellion. They did not need to raise a single weapon. The widow was speaking for them all. Her stance alone told the story, that the time of fear was ending. The banker's confidence drained as he looked into the eyes of those gathered. The walls of his empire, built on lies and intimidation, were crumbling around him. For the first time, he realized the widow was not alone. She carried the weight of the entire town behind her. And as she inched closer, rifle still fixed on him, The banker felt the truth settle like a stone in his chest. He had created his own executioner, and she had nothing left to lose. The wind swept through the street, rattling signs and stirring the dust, as if the land itself waited for what was to come. The widow stood within arm's length of the banker now, her voice low but cutting through the silence like steel. "You mistook my grief for weakness," she said, "but grief can forge a weapon stronger than greed. And today, you will learn that truth." Her eyes burned, not with rage, but with clarity, the look of someone who had already walked through the fire and come out forged by it. The banker stumbled back a step, his bravado crumbling. Sweat streaked down his temple, his hand twitching as though to reach for the pistol at his hip. The widow's rifle clicked, the sound echoing across the street like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the banker froze, knowing that one wrong move would seal his fate. For the first time, his power meant nothing. No deed, no contract, no ounce of gold could shield him from the justice staring him down. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying the weight of guilt and redemption. "You've stolen enough, banker. This town has bled for your greed." His words, simple yet firm, broke the last chain of silence holding the crowd. Murmurs turned into shouts, men and women calling for justice, their voices rising like a storm. The widow did not turn to acknowledge them. Her eyes remained locked on the man who had stolen her life. But the sound of the town behind her strengthened her resolve. The banker looked around, desperate, searching for allies, but found none. The crowd that once bowed to his wealth now stood tall in defiance. Even the saloon doors, once open to his celebrations, seemed to close against him. He was a man undone, his empire turned to dust by the weight of one woman's courage. And in that moment, he understood that even if he survived the widow's rifle, he would never again own the fear of this town. The widow lifted her chin, her voice carrying across the street for all to hear. "You can take land. You can take gold. But you cannot take a soul that refuses to bow." The crowd fell silent again, the power of her words striking deeper than any bullet. The rifle remained steady, the air heavy with anticipation, as the widow stood poised between vengeance and justice, the line as thin as the trigger beneath her finger. The tension in the street reached its breaking point. The banker's hand twitched near his holster, his eyes darting between the rifle pointed at his chest and the crowd that had once feared him but now looked on with grim resolve. His pride demanded he stand tall, but the truth pressed on him heavier than the desert sun. He was cornered, not by bullets, but by justice that had finally risen from the dust. The widow saw the tremor in his hands, the panic behind his sneer. She knew men like him relied on fear, on silence, on the weight of gold to keep them untouchable. But now the gold was worthless, for no one dared to step forward and defend him. The crowd's silence had changed. It was no longer submission, but judgment. And judgment, she thought, was a power greater than any weapon. The sheriff, though silent, shifted closer, his hand ready near his revolver. Yet his eyes told the story. He would not stop her. He had allowed the banker's greed to go unchecked for too long, and now he seemed ready to let the widow's rifle restore what the law had failed to defend. It was a reckoning, one that even the badge could not interfere with. The banker spat into the mud, desperate to mask his fear with bravado. "You'll hang for this, woman," he snarled. "This town will turn on you as quick as it turned on me." But even as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded. The murmurs in the crowd only grew louder, their faces hardened, their loyalty shifting away from gold and toward the truth standing before them. The widow took another step forward, the rifle steady in her hands. "I've buried a husband," she said softly, "and I've buried my children's future in the soil you stole. If I must bury my own life today, so be it. But I will not bury my honor." Her words cut through the storm of fear, leaving silence in their wake. The entire town seemed to lean forward, waiting for the strike of thunder that would decide their fate. The banker's bravado collapsed at last. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darting wildly for an escape that did not exist. The walls of his office could not shield him, nor could the ink of his contracts save him now. The crowd's eyes had become a jury, and the widow their voice. He raised his hands slowly, his pride shattering with emotion. For the first time, The man who thought himself untouchable looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The sheriff stepped closer, his voice carrying authority for the first time in years. "It's over," he said, his tone firm but calm. "Your gold won't save you, banker. You'll answer for what you've done." The crowd stirred, relief mingling with astonishment. The lawman had finally spoken, but they all knew it was the widow's courage that had forced his hand. Without her, the silence of fear would have continued to rule them all. The widow's eyes never left the banker. Slowly, she lowered her rifle, not in surrender, but in triumph. She had not needed to pull the trigger to win. Her weapon had been her resolve, her refusal to be erased, her defiance in the face of power. The town had seen it, had felt it, and in that moment, the greedy banker lost more than land. He lost the chains of fear that had bound the people for so long. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective exhale of freedom. Some wept quietly, others held their children closer, knowing that something had shifted forever. The widow stood still, her chest rising and falling with slow breaths, her hands finally trembling as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. She was not just a woman who had been wronged. She was the proof that justice could rise even in the harshest of places. As the banker was dragged away under the sheriff's watch, the widow lifted her eyes to the sky. The sun shone bright on the horizon, casting its light across the town. She had lost everything, yes, but she had reclaimed something far greater. In the heart of the Old West, where greed often ruled, she had reminded them all of a truth no gold could erase: that when a soul has nothing left to lose, it becomes unstoppable. The sheriff's office filled with tension as the banker sat shackled, his face pale, his pride shattered. He muttered curses under his breath, but they sounded more like the ramblings of a man broken than the threats of someone in power. Outside, the town gathered in restless silence, their eyes shifting often toward the widow. She stood apart from them, her rifle across her back, her posture steady though exhaustion weighed heavily on her bones. She had not set out to lead a revolution, yet the moment she chose to confront greed, she had ignited one. Children whispered her name in awe, women looked at her with quiet admiration, and men who had once avoided her gaze now tipped their hats with respect. The widow, however, did not bask in their stares. She thought of the long nights of sorrow, of her husband's calloused hands, of the sound of laughter that had once filled her home before debts and lies had stolen it all away. Her stand had not been about glory. It had been about remembrance, about refusing to let her family's memory be buried under contracts and ink. The banker's allies, wealthy ranchers and merchants who had profited from his schemes, began to whisper among themselves, fear carving cracks into their arrogance. If one widow could dismantle their strongest man, what would happen when the rest of the town followed her example? The sheriff, sensing this shift, walked the streets with newfound resolve. His presence no longer fell hollow. It carried the weight of a law reborn, one that would no longer bend to gold, but bow only to truth. That night, lanterns glowed in windows across town, their warm light breaking the shadows of fear that had long hung over the streets. Families sat together, speaking in hushed voices about what had unfolded, each word carrying the seeds of courage. The widow watched from her porch, the land no longer legally hers, yet more truly hers than it had ever been. For though paper claimed it belonged to the banker, the town now understood it belonged to her blood, her sacrifice, and her refusal to surrender. But even as calm settled, the widow knew the story was not yet finished. Men like the banker always had allies, and greed was a stubborn weed that grew back stronger when cut down. She kept her rifle close that night, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had won a battle, yes, but the war for dignity, for justice, for the soul of the West, was only just beginning. Days turned into weeks, and whispers of the widow's defiance spread far beyond the borders of town. Travelers carried her story across the prairie, into saloons, and along lonely trails. In a land starved for heroes, her name was spoken with reverence, her image painted in the minds of those who longed for justice. She became more than a widow with a rifle. She became a living symbol of resistance, proof that even those stripped of everything could rise unbroken. Yet symbols are dangerous to those who thrive on power. The banker's allies, humiliated by his downfall, began plotting in the shadows. They feared not only her rifle, but her example. If one woman could turn the tide, others might follow. And so, they schemed to silence her, whispering threats, hiring guns, preparing to reclaim control by force. The widow sensed it coming, felt it in the unease of the townsfolk, in the way strangers lingered too long near the edge of her land. The sheriff stood by her more openly now, his guilt transformed into loyalty. "You've given these people hope," he said one evening, his voice low, his eyes on the fading horizon. "But hope paints a target. They'll come for you, and when they do, they won't make the mistake of underestimating you again." The widow nodded, her fingers brushing the rifle's stock. She had no illusions left. Vengeance was relentless, and the price of defiance was always steep. Still, she refused to bend. The rifle her husband had left her was more than a weapon. It was the last piece of him, a bridge between past and future, grief and strength. She would not let it gather dust. Each morning she stood at the edge of her land, watching the sun rise, her silhouette etched against the light like a promise. The banker had taken everything, but he had also awakened something he could never own, her unyielding resolve. The town, once silent and fearful, now stood taller because of her. And though she carried her grief like a shadow, she also carried the fire of justice, a fire no amount of gold could extinguish. In the West, legends were not born from comfort but from defiance, and the widow, rifle in hand, had become one. But as the wind howled across the prairie, she knew her hardest trial still lay ahead, waiting just beyond the horizon. The widow became a figure of quiet strength in the days that followed. She did not boast of what she had done, nor did she seek praise. Instead, she moved with the same calm determination that had carried her through her darkest nights. Yet everywhere she walked, the townsfolk parted with respect. For them, she was no longer just the woman who had lost everything. She was the one who had taught them that silence in the face of injustice was as deadly as a loaded gun. The banker's allies tried to sow doubt, whispering that she was reckless, dangerous, a spark that could burn them all. But their words fell flat. The people had seen the truth with their own eyes, and truth has a way of rooting itself deeper than lies. Farmers who once bent under unfair debts now spoke more boldly. Merchants refused to sign away their dignity, and the sheriff carried himself with new weight, reminded that his badge meant something after all. At night, as the stars stretched endless above the prairie, the widow often sat on the porch of the land that was still legally contested. Papers might claim it belonged to the banker, but the earth itself seemed to say otherwise. She would run her hand along the rifle across her lap and listen to the wind rustling through the dry grass. It was as if her husband's voice whispered in the silence, telling her she had honored him not with tears, but with action. One evening, a young girl from the town approached her timidly, clutching a bundle of wildflowers. "Mama says you're the bravest person she's ever known," the girl said, her eyes wide. The widow smiled faintly, taking the flowers with hands that had known both work and war. "Bravery," she answered softly, "isn't about being unafraid. It's about standing even when fear tries to break you." The girl's smile grew, and with that simple exchange, the widow realized that her fight had already planted seeds for the next generation. But courage often carries a cost. Riders have been seen on the outskirts, watching from afar, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. The widow knew their kind, guns hired not for justice, but for gold. The banker's pride may have been broken, but his reach was long, and his vengeance patient. She kept her rifle close at night, for the West had taught her one lesson above all. When you strike at greed, it always tries to strike back. The test came sooner than expected. Under a pale dawn sky, hoofbeats thundered toward the edge of town. Dust rose like smoke as 3 armed riders appeared, their eyes cold, their hands resting on holsters that had ended more lives than the law could count. The townsfolk peered nervously from windows, their newfound courage shaken by the sight of hardened killers. Yet the widow stepped into the street, rifle in hand, her black dress whipping in the morning wind. She had faced fire, she had faced shame, and she would face this too. The riders slowed, sneers curling on their lips. "The banker sends his regards," one of them drawled, his hand twitching near his revolver. The widow did not flinch. Her voice, calm and steady, carried across the silence. "Tell your banker this land has already claimed more honest blood than he'll ever spill. If he wants more, he'll have to pay the price himself." Her words struck like bullets, heavier than the steel she carried. Behind her, the sheriff appeared, his revolver drawn, and beside him the father of the rescued child from months before, shotgun in hand. Slowly, one by one, others stepped into the street. Farmers, ranchers, townsfolk who had once cowered but now refused to let her stand alone. The riders glanced at the crowd forming behind the widow and realized this was no longer her fight alone. Her courage had become theirs. The standoff stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap with the pull of a trigger. But the riders, hardened though they were, understood what they saw. Not just a widow with a rifle, but a town reborn, unwilling to bow to fear again. With curses under their breath, they yanked their reins and turned their horses back to the horizon, retreating into the dust. The town exhaled as one, their fear replaced by a pride that rang louder than any gunfire. The widow lowered her rifle slowly, her breath steady. She had not fired a shot, but she had won the war that mattered most, the war for the spirit of her people. In the Old West, legends were carved not only with bullets, but with resolve, and hers would be remembered long after the banker's name had turned to ash. She had walked into dawn with nothing but grief and a loaded rifle, and by sheer will, she had transformed loss into legacy. The widow's story did not end with the riders turning back. It began there. She had stepped into the street armed with nothing but her grief, her resolve, and a rifle worn by years of use. What she proved was not just that one woman could face down power, but that a single act of defiance could awaken the spirit of an entire town. In standing for her honor, she reminded everyone that dignity is worth more than land, gold, or the fear that had once silenced them. The greedy banker had believed he owned everything, property, people, even their silence. Yet when the widow stood before him, she shattered the illusion that wealth could bury truth. She revealed the West's harshest lesson. Power built on fear collapses the moment courage rises to meet it. His downfall was not written by contracts or coins, but by the will of those who refused to bow any longer. The sheriff's silence had once been complicity, but her courage forced him to remember the oath he had forgotten. And in that reflection, the town too found its voice. No badge or law could have saved them. Only the unbreakable spirit of someone who had lost everything and yet refused to surrender. Her fight became theirs, proving that unity born from justice is stronger than any weapon drawn from greed. The widow's tale lingers because it is more than a story of vengeance. It is a story of transformation. It shows us that despair can be reforged into strength, and that the moment we stand, even when alone, we may find countless others rising with us. Her walk into dawn was not the end of her grief, but the birth of her legacy, a reminder that the West never forgets those who choose courage over surrender. If this story moved you, let its flame burn beyond this moment. Share in the comments what part of her journey struck deepest in your heart. Was it her silence, her defiance, or the way she carried the weight of so many? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so together we can keep uncovering tales that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power hidden in the human spirit. For in the end, legends like hers do not fade. They live on in those willing to listen.